Being Dean of Birmingham Business School is a great job. It's one I enjoy very much. It's hard work, but it's a wonderful school. I have committed academic colleagues doing excellent research, very dedicated to their teaching, and of course we have wonderful students. It's a global, international community. It's a great place to work. I think it's a really good idea for academics and businesses to work together for responsible business goals, because I think there's a lot that both parties can learn from each other, so academics can bring theoretical and practical understandings of the key challenges that face businesses. So I think it's the real opportunity to produce synergies between business with academia to come together to cast light and understanding on what are the really important issues of the day in building a better world. Academics understand some of the deep challenges and can contribute their knowledge and their understanding to practitioners in business as they develop their strategies going forward. I think it's really important for us as a business school to embed responsible business thinking and practice in everything we do. After all, we're educating the managers of the future, so it's crucial to embed in them thinking about responsible business, both skills and practice, so that we can ensure a positive future. I think from my perspective, looking forward, a responsible future for academia and business is about thinking about what kind of future we want. The future we want for our students, our colleagues, our families, and seeing what we can do as a school to strive to encourage and facilitate that future through everything that we do.
Well, welcome to this session about the critical importance of education and business in working in partnership to meet the global responsible business challenge. My name's Tom Levitt, and I'll be discussing this issue with three guests very shortly. But to set the scene, I'd like to start off with a few words from the chair of the board at the Said Business School in Oxford, Paul Pullman. And Paul was, of course, the chief executive of Unilever. And when he left that position a few months ago, he just completed a 10-year program of possibly one of the biggest sustainability policy implementations that we've seen in the corporate sector from one of the world's leading food companies. So let's listen to what Paul's experience has been and what his ambitions are for the role of business schools when working with business to produce a more sustainable and responsible environment for working in for the future.
Well, hello everybody. I'm Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever and the co-founder of a social enterprise called Imagine, which collectively mobilizes business leaders across the value chain to tackle especially our two most burning issues, climate change and global inequality. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I know that you're in very safe hands with Tom. Tom, thank you again for your inspiring leadership. As you know, the world is currently in the grip of the COVID pandemic, a health and economic crisis like no other that is dramatically impacting both lives and livelihoods. But regrettably, it's not the only challenge that we face. We are now confronted by multiple health, economic, social, and environmental crises. COVID has shown us that we cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet, nor can we have infinite growth on a finite planet. More and more feel that our current capitalistic model of growth has actually run its course. The growth inequality have left billions of people without access to basic needs such as education, healthcare, and sanitation. Technology, despite its enormous benefits, also threatens the income security of millions. And populism and racial tension are straining national cohesion and, dare I say, multilateral cooperation. And most dangerous of all is runaway climate change, probably the biggest intergenerational crime ever committed, literally posing an existential threat to humanity. It is clear that we have reached a critical inflection point and that we have no time to lose in building back better so that we can protect our people and planet for generations to come. Now, many of us are starting to work this, and indeed, increasingly solutions are within our reach. As someone recently said, never ever have we been so forewarned, but also forearmed to do something about it. Science, new forms of partnership, but above all, leadership will play a key role. Therefore, carving this new path will not be possible if we don't include actively the business schools. They sit at the nexus of society. Their research informs and inspires, and their teaching prepares leaders for the challenges of the future. As Nelson Mandela rightfully said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. So how can business schools unlock their full potential? Well, first by recognizing what is missing. Undoubtedly, business schools should promote lifelong learning to prepare students for a new world order that is subject to perpetual change, as well as disruption, owing to the fourth industrial revolution. They should also be more inclusive and proactively embrace diversity in all its dimensions. And they should equally actively embrace the digital to combine online learning with offline activities, leveraging the increasing power of cloud computing, data analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence that will simultaneously improve the curriculum, but also hopefully reach more students. All of this is not easy to do when you have to navigate the current environment where COVID has significantly disrupted both the advanced and executive education, and where budgets are under pressure. And frankly, so are faculty and staff. I don't envy you. But perhaps the biggest change in management education has to come from what we teach. Clearly, the leadership we have developed collectively has not been able to deal sufficiently with these global challenges. Trust in business is low, and many don't feel that their leaders show the moral leadership to address today's challenges. To be provocative, have we been teaching the wrong stuff? In the extreme, some are arguing that we should shut down every business school. This rant is obviously hyperbolic, but the reasoning is that business schools typically emphasize that things like marketing, finance, or quantitative rules, whilst the people stuff and cultural stuff get the short shrift in virtually all cases. Also here, I believe, we have fallen victim to shareholder primacy. Many MBAs are addicted to spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. And we've fallen short in many places with a simple, myopic focus on market share and profitability only. And business school ranking, by the way, that's based on earning power, not impact power. As more aspire to multi-stakeholder or moral capitalism, so do we need to create the leaders that can create this. Business now more than ever need to play a leading role in solving the world's problems and not creating them. They have to become what I call net positive contributors to society, with purpose at its core to profitably solve the issues of people and planet. It requires leaders that understand this. Now, with an average tenure of a Fortune 500 CEO now well below 5 years, and frankly a life expectancy of corporations now less than 17 years, we have our jobs cut out. The idea that maximizing shareholder value as a company's raison d'etre, I believe, is now passé. We now need to teach purpose, value creation through values, and responsible moral leadership. A servant mentality versus a taker mentality. It requires connecting science, technology, engineering, and mathematics with the humanities and social sciences to create the system thinkers of tomorrow and the leaders able to work in broader partnership across society to address the toughest challenges. And hopefully, and most important of all, the school of the future should help every student to find their purpose and passion, to help them become real change makers. We are truly blessed to have so many gifted young people at this crucial juncture in history. Over half the world population is below 30 years old. And as we've seen from many youth climate movements, they are agitating and mobilizing like never before. We should welcome their energy, creativity, passion, and self-belief. We should embolden their innate ability to accept uncertainty, and we should encourage their enormous appetite for collaboration and partnerships, which we know are key to making progress on our biggest social and environmental opportunities. Not least of all, delivering the UN Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement, which act as a bulwark for sustainable and inclusive growth. More purpose driven, tolerant, open, and accountable than any generation before them. They are primed to make an enormous impact on the issues that matter. Now is the moment, not only to give them a seat at the leadership table, but dare I say, give them perhaps the table itself. Business schools are uniquely placed to help accelerate this transition. And a good start for this transition would be to put moral leadership, public good, and impact at the heart of student learning and development. Thank you again for everything that you are doing to advance this critical agenda. Good luck with your discussions. Above all, be ambitious. And best wishes for a healthy and successful 2021, the year of delivery. Thank you very much.
Joining me today, I have Caroline Hill, who is responsible for responsible business at Lloyds Bank, which is the sponsor in its turn of the Centre for Responsible Business at the University of Birmingham, where I sit on the advisory board, by the way. We have Yvonne Hackforth-Williams, who is the Director of Operations at that same business school at the University of Birmingham. And if you're wondering what Martin Kitchener's connection with Birmingham is, just listen when he speaks and it'll be very, very clear. Martin is Professor of Management at the University of Cardiff, and he and I have spent the last 2 years working together, heading up a task force for the Chartered Association of Business Schools, where we're examining the relationship between business schools and the public good. So to set the scene a little further, following Paul's remarks, I'm going to ask Martin to introduce that work and to say why it is, from the business school's point of view, that we think it's necessary to have an investigation into how business schools can contribute to the public good and what we hope will come out of it. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you much indeed, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from Cardiff. As Tom mentioned, we've been working for the last 2 years on a project that's sponsored by the Chartered Association of Business Schools. Every 2 or 3 years ago or so, the Chartered ABS commissions an investigation into how UK business schools, and there's around about 120 of them, how those business schools are contributing to some of the grand challenges, some of the wicked problems that are besetting society at the moment. The current task force is looking at ways in which business schools address or enhance the public good. This is not a topic that's been considered before within the context of business schools, although, as Paul Pullman so eloquently pointed out, it is one of the major challenges that is facing all organisations, whether they be corporate, whether they be educational, whether they work in the third sector, whichever sector. Everyone, every organisation is being increasingly expected to account for itself, to license its operations with an explanation of the way in which it serves people other than its employees, its shareholders, the greater good, if you like, of society. The contributions that business schools have made in the UK and globally, and there's around about 13,000 business schools in the UK, are well documented. They are the largest single providers of undergraduate education. They teach more postgraduate students than any other academic discipline. And by very many measures, business schools have been the success story of higher education. They have been the area of higher education that have grown most rapidly and that regularly contribute to the best employment outcomes for students. So on those two measures, in terms of economic contribution and in terms of employment prospects of students, business schools are phenomenally successful. Increasingly, however, as major employers and as major players in higher education, people have been asking, what is the wider social value of business schools? And especially in the wake of some of the better publicised corporate scandals, where some of the people at the centre of those scandals have been traced back their education to business schools, people have asked, what are business schools really doing and what is their purpose? And I think a very interesting question to ask here, and ask ourselves as business school academics, is very often we're involved in a one-way transfer of knowledge where we take it upon ourselves to teach students and make suggestions to business about how they should best operate in terms of accounting, marketing, strategy, and whatever. It seems to me we're in a position now where in certain respects, corporations and part of the business world might be a little bit more advanced in their thinking and practice in terms of purpose than our business schools that are supposed to be at the forefront of this thinking. Now, Paul mentioned the idea of organisational purpose, and there is a growing social movement, I think it would be quite apt to call it, of people in industry, in commerce, who are increasingly moving away from the idea that businesses exist solely to deliver shareholder value or shareholder profit. That is an idea that's held sway certainly since the late 70s and 80s. And that's beginning to break down in large parts of business and commerce. Yet it still forms the basis of what most business schools teach most of the time. So we're in a funny position where some people have argued that business schools have really got to adapt to their environments and almost catch up with industry in order to meet the requirements of business. Business is saying, we are changing our ways. We recognise that the people we are employing increasingly have different ideas about what organisations should be doing in their purpose. And really, we need your help to educate those students in those new ways of thinking. And I think business schools are increasingly asking themselves, are we standing up to that new agenda? So that is really the kind of context to the work of our task force. And we're starting from a position where very little is actually known about what business schools actually do and how they go about doing it. Business schools spend a lot of time researching banks, automotive manufacturers, third sector organisations. Far less time is spent actually looking and examining and being reflexive about what we actually do and how we do it. So we're starting from a point where very little was known about what does the public good mean in the context of business schools. So our first question that we asked for a survey of all the business school deans in the United Kingdom is, what do you think is the public good of business schools and how are you doing it? And it was no surprise to us that we got almost as many responses as there are business schools. There is no consensus about what the public good means in terms of business schools. What was slightly more surprising was there wasn't any grouping or pattern of response from the main types of business schools. The research-led schools, the teaching-led schools, the bigger ones, the smaller ones, the ones in Wales, the ones in Northern England. There was no pattern to the response at all. So it's a very, very fragmented approach. And as you might expect as well, quite often we would get responses saying, we're doing a lot about public good, we're passionate about it, it's a strategic priority. When we came on to some of our later questions in our survey, okay, so what are you actually doing? Things became a little bit less clear and a little bit less apparent. The actual concrete examples were somewhat harder to find. So in response to that, we picked up on some of the, what we're labeling more promising practices that emerged from the four main activity areas for most business schools. That's their teaching, their research, the external engagement outside of universities, and what we're calling their operations, the ways that they actually organise themselves. And we're just writing this up now in terms of our final report, but we've identified something like 26 promising practices across those four areas of business school activity that we think provide a really strong basis for learning for other business schools. We recognise that all business schools, or most business schools, that they're not the same. There is some inherent differences, but we think there's an element to which some of these more promising practices might be transferable across other schools and provide almost inspiration for those schools that did want to take this agenda a little bit further. So I think that gives a flavour of the work, and I'm really very, very excited about the range and the variety of examples that we've got. But I think one of my main takeaway points from what we found so far is that I think we found an area here where there's a great potential, perhaps, for business schools to learn from industry and from commerce. And I think great examples are provided by examples like Unilever and Lloyds through their sponsorship of the centre at Birmingham. You know, there's some really good practices. I think there's greater opportunities developing for that engagement if only business schools could be a little bit perhaps more appreciative of the potential from learning from people that they've traditionally seen as the targets of their education, rather than maybe the sources of learning and inspiration. And I think around the area of purpose, that might be something that would be a very interesting area for business schools to explore.
Thank you very much indeed. Caroline, if I can turn to you, you've heard about the task force, you've heard Paul Pullman's contribution. What is it that Lloyds Bank gets out of sponsoring a Centre for Responsible Business? What do you mean by responsible business, and how optimistic are you that Written PLC will be delivering it?
So it's great to be part of the panel today, and responsible business is really at the heart of Lloyds Banking Group, hence our sponsorship of the centre, and it's enormously valuable for us to get an outside perspective on these topics. At Lloyds Banking Group, our purpose is to help Britain prosper, and all the work we do in responsible business and sustainability really has that as its starting point. And this year in particular, given all the difficulties everybody has had, we're very much focused on helping Britain recover. And I think, and there's a number of different programmes as part of that, but I think listening and learning from the outside and having the ability to draw on this academic knowledge and research is hugely valuable for us. I enjoyed all the comments made by the last speaker in terms of setting out the stall there, and I think it's a very interesting point about whether perhaps some businesses are now quite advanced in terms of thinking about purpose and the drivers for that, and how business schools need to keep pace with that as well.
And is that something you work with your customers on as well? I mean, do you practice what you preach?
I think for every business, this is all work in progress. You know, I don't think any business could say they're kind of tick job done on responsible business. The agenda is so fast moving. So for us, it's such a broad range of activities, but customers are at the heart of it, and helping our customers transition to a greener economy, helping our customers gain access to quality housing, helping people recover post-pandemic in terms of financial resilience, supporting small businesses. There's such a huge range of topics that this covers at Lloyds, but the customer is absolutely the heart of that.
And Yvonne, I appreciate your director of operations, but I suppose what I'm going to ask you is a bit more to do with the curriculum. But Is the curriculum changing quickly enough to deal with this very broad agenda of responsibility that we've been talking about?
It's certainly changing. Whether it's changing quickly enough, I think, is always a challenge for universities. I think they're kind of to respond sort of quickly enough to what's going outside. But certainly at Birmingham, where responsible business is a kind of central unifying theme around which all our research and teaching can kind of sit, we've spent a lot of time really thinking about how we think about responsible business, not as an add-on to the curriculum, but really as an integrated part of the curriculum, and something that every student that goes through the business school will need to have an understanding of, and the skills to respond to those challenges that are coming in the future, regardless of what particular discipline that they're studying. So we've spent a lot of time working on that integration, and of just completing an exercise to map all of the modules of learning that students will undertake. So all the different sort of subjects and topics they will cover during a degree, or undergraduate or postgraduate, to the UN Sustainability Development Goals, so that there's a very clear link between what they're learning in the classroom and what impact that will have in the outside world. And I think this is where business schools working in partnership with organisations like Lloyd's and others is so important, because it's by bringing in that real-time, real-life expertise into the curriculum that students get an appreciation of how they take what they're learning and apply it to a real dilemma that a business might be facing, whether that's setting up a green energy plant or whatever it might be. So I think we're sort of making really good progress around that. And I think something for me that has been really helpful in that is how unifying it is for students, because just as businesses are employers of our future students, so we're having to think about, well, what do they need from our students? How do we make them great employees of the future or business leaders of the future? It's also what our students are interested in. That shifted just as, the talk about, shareholder value that maybe a student of 20 years ago might have been really interested in. Now, a lot of our students, want to have want to make a positive difference in the world and see business and industry as a way of enabling to do them. So we're also sort of responding to what the students want as well.
Well, what the students want might be an interesting question to look at a bit further, because as we know, business schools are one part of the university world which actually, dare we say it, makes a profit, delivers to the university bottom line. And if I'm Chinese and I'm ambitious and I want to come to Britain and I want to maximize my earning potential, maximize the profit worthiness of my company, I want to come and I want to get the basics and I want to get out there again, and I'm willing to pay good money for it. Do we know what students want? I mean, surely different students want different things.
Yes, I mean, they do, but I think it's, the world in which our students will, be living in the future is perhaps a world that was different to ours. So even, students who, and many of our students, I'm sure, will want to go and have very successful and well-paid careers, and that's not mutually exclusive. But they will need to do that in a world that is grappling with these issues. And if they're not able to deal with these issues, then the future is less bright for all of us. So I think there's an aspirational, idealistic student, and there's also perhaps slightly more self-interested students. And I think, there's the recognition of what the challenges that the world is facing, and the ability to respond to those challenges is really important regardless of what they are. And I think the last year has really shown, has illustrated that really, really well to people. And it's not just about knowledge, it's about skills and, thought leadership and shared values and all of those kinds of things.
Martin, one of the things I've been impressed with are looking at the replies from business schools as part of the work of the task force. has been the influence of PRIME, the United Nations Principles of Responsible Management Education. What sort of, but only a minority of our business schools are currently signed up to support PRIME. So what can PRIME bring to a business school?
I think you're right to be impressed with the potential there for PRIME. I think I'd be a little bit more measured in my optimism as being an engine of significant change within business schools. I think we know how these things work typically, and I think when organisations sign up to these voluntary initiatives, there's very often good meaning and a lot of energy around the initial stages. But then in terms of actually driving sustainable and meaningful change in organisations, I'm not sure that it has yet been as successful as we might have wished. The way that it's organised and the requirement to produce these periodic updates on what organisations or what business schools have done towards the principles of PRIME, I think that's a useful nudge and a prod. But having waded through all of the UK reports submitted in that way, there's a real sniff there of kind of compliance coming from those reports, and a little bit less energy than might have been displayed in the initial application process. So I think it's a useful driver for change, but I think without real commitment and real resource support at the school level, I think the potential for meaningful change is perhaps not as strong as some people would hope for. We have seen examples of schools in our work that may well be signatories to PRIME, that when asked for real meaningful examples of changes across its activities have been really struggling yet to provide examples. So I think it's a useful instrument, it's a useful process for organisations to go through, but I think far more important is the role of champions within schools, and then the extent to which that good meaning and intent is embedded at the strategic level in schools, and then supported by resources.
And that intent can really be summed up as bringing the work of the business school into line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which essentially sums up PRIME in a sentence.
Yeah.
Yvonne, at Birmingham, clearly it's more than just a box-ticking exercise to be associated with PRIME for Birmingham. But how do we sell the idea to other business schools, to every business school, that this is not just a nice thing to have, a certificate for the wall, but is actually a meaningful plan way forward for all business schools to go?
Well, I think it's really interesting that Martin mentions about champions and about strategic champions within the school. I think if we go back sort of 3 years within Birmingham, it was having some really, enthusiastic individuals. I think the partnership that we have with Lloyds, which created a sort of a centre and a focus around responsible business, was really helpful as a catalyst in having those conversations. So we've been on a, it's over time that we've become more and more where responsible business has become a theme that we all integrate around. Whereas I think in the beginning it was having both the individuals whose perhaps research was in that area and enthusiastic about that area, and then some meaningful partnerships like the one we have with Lloyds to really act as a driver. So it doesn't become just another thing that business schools have to do or another accreditation, but actually it's a core part of delivering our research as well, which really kind of helped it at Birmingham.
Is that how you see PRIME as well, Caroline? How do you see your relationship? Presumably you look for research and so on, not just at Birmingham, but you try to be aware of what's going on elsewhere as well. So what are your priorities there?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting because there's a similar scheme called the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, which we complete at Lloyd's every year. And I sort of hear Martin's points about these things need to be more than just kind of tick box, right? That's that job done for another year. It needs to be really lived and owned in the business. And I think the way that really can come about is by senior leadership really getting behind something, and so that people are really passionate and proud of what they've achieved, and then maybe then filling the form is just it's a task to do, but it's not the driver of it at all. And I think the UN Sustainable Development Goals have been quite an important part of that for us at Lloyd's. And I think for corporates generally, what you'll see nowadays is a lot of corporates with their sustainability and responsible business reporting, including Lloyd's, will map the different programs that we've got underway in the business. How do they support the different 17 SDGs? We can't do everything. So what are the ones we're focusing on, and why, and how do we think we can make an impact? And I think that definitely has been a very useful driver for us and our programs.
What happens, Yvonne, if you get resistance within a business school? If you get people who say, well, this is the way I've always taught it, I'm going to carry on teaching it this way. How do we change minds in that respect?
I mean, I think, as a university, we're a civic university. I think, we've got a civic mission that goes back 100 years. That idea of positive change and doing good in the world, I think, is something that, a broad church of people can get behind. So I think, I think from a teaching perspective, there is that, the enthusiasm of the majority, is kind of sufficient in that area to bring people through. And I think, again, this is where, if people are working closely with businesses in their research, or through, students doing internships or coming in and running, projects and things, they're hearing that dialogue come back from businesses and the concern around responsible business. So it helps to, embed that recognition that this is, high on the agenda of businesses, and therefore it needs to be high on the agenda of teaching. I mean, I think how people teach things, there's still a lot of, opportunity for academic input and for people to take their own take. It's not about everyone agreeing, all the time about everything. In academia, part of our independent role, as Caroline was saying, is about having a kind of a range of opinions and basing things on different research. And that's really important for students to hear the range of opinions of things and have that within their teaching experience. So it's not about everyone kind of slavishly agreeing to one view of the world, but it's a kind of a core principle around which most people can kind of fairly happily and with that's in line with their own sort of core values and principles support.
Caroline, coming back to you, I think that one principle which, if I were to choose one thing to change in the whole of business, it would be simply to stop concentrating on the short term and raise your eyes up and look at the long term, because things fall into a different perspective when you do that. I mean, clearly short term you buy the cheapest energy, but long term that might not be the best for the future of the planet and humanity, for heaven's sake. Would you agree with that? And how do we go about moving from the short term to the long term in business?
I think that's a really important point, and certainly in business, when Paul Polman was leading Unilever, they moved away from having quarterly reporting for that exact reason, and I think a number of businesses have since followed suit. And certainly having that longer term vision is really, I think, and moving away from just making whatever in the immediate short term might be the quickest return is something that all businesses need to reflect on. Our Helping Britain Prosper plan was I think it long predates my arrival at Lloyd's Banking Group, but it was like a 10-year mapped vision of what Lloyd's wanted to do to help Britain prosper, and we're now in this movement on to helping Britain recover. But if I think about our carbon targets, these are long-term, these are 2030 targets. And I think, and they need to be, because these are big challenges that businesses need to work on and can't possibly be achieved in the short term. But there is a tension there still, I think, in business between returns in the immediate short term versus the longer term vision and what needs to be done. And I think that's a debate that's healthy to have at top tables, whether an academic institution or a business. Yeah.
Martin, we talked about the difficulty of bringing about change. There is a school of thought which says that education is itself a public good, and business schools are contributing to a public good, even in their traditional form, because they're providing people with the skills to maximise their career prospects and to help their companies. But you're looking for much more than that, aren't you? I mean, why can't that be accepted anymore as the sole definition of doing good in business education?
I fully accept that most education institutions, just through their everyday daily activities, deliver a significantly important amount of public good just through their education activities. That's absolutely right. I think we can and we need to do an awful lot more. I think it's interesting the way Caroline mentioned purpose and Paul mentioned purpose. This is a discussion, it seems to me, that's going on more at the moment amongst corporations than it is amongst educational bodies and certainly amongst business schools. There has been an argument that higher education in general and business schools in particular have lost their way. They have lost their sense of purpose, where once they stood for principles of educating, leaders and managers, that as the nature of higher education changed, too many people's attention was caught by what we've been talking about as being problems of commerce, short-termism, individualism. Academics being caught in this requirement that to advance their careers they must publish. It might not necessarily matter what they published, as long as it got published. It might be helpful, it might be unhelpful, what have you. And that business schools have been accused of operating as the cash cows of higher education, with not much opportunity to pause for thought about what they're actually trying to do. I think there are a number of schools in the UK where that is not the case. I think there are maybe 4 or 5 beacon schools that have paused and really thought seriously about what the purpose of a business school can be and should be, and that they've begun to significantly make alterations across their activities in teaching, research, engagement, operations. And Birmingham, to my mind, is a great example of that, how under an inspired leadership team, working with partners that are external to that, have brought about changes across the school that are aligned to a sense of purpose. It was one of the perhaps more disappointing findings of our task force work, how few business schools were able to offer an articulation of their purpose. They've all got mission statements, they've all got value statements, they've all got aspirations for this and that, but a sense of what they're actually supposed to be doing. It was really noticeable by its absence. So I think, in addition to signing up to voluntary accreditations and kite marks, I think now is the time for business schools to have a serious conversation with themselves about what they're looking to do and how they're looking to do it, and what changes need to be made across their operations. And those are going to involve very, very difficult choices, because as we know, business schools are some of the largest financial contributors, not only to their university, but to their local economies. Business schools, unlike other academic departments in universities, are in the lucky position of being able to attract significant numbers of international students. This is the revenue of many universities. But with that comes all sorts of problems. These students have a huge carbon footprint, and there's other issues involved. And it's not clear that many universities are able to easily walk away from that. And of course, international students bring an awful lot of benefits to the UK and to the diverse student body. So these are very, very tricky issues for business schools, but one which, in my view, leads now is the time to have a real good think about purpose in a way that I think is being done perhaps more in some corporations than it is in higher education. And this is the opportunity for us to learn, from the Lloyds, from the Unilevers. What can we learn from them?
I'm absolutely confident that if I were to ask Yvonne and Caroline at this moment, state the purpose of your organisation, you could tell me, but I won't put you on the spot, other than just to say, if you go to a cocktail party and ask everybody in the room to state the purpose of their organisation, if you can get two who say the same thing, and even better, if you can get two from the same organisation who say the same thing, then you're doing very well indeed, in my experience. I want to come back to this short-term, long-term thing, because the problem with educating undergraduates in business skills, business-related skills, is they're not going to be the leaders in business for another 20 years. So we've got to think, therefore, about what MBAs do and what research does. And Yvonne, my question is, you do a lot of different research and MBA opportunities, provide a lot of MBA opportunities, but do you actually measure what changes as a result of that? And I'm going to ask Caroline in a moment to answer that from the point of view of a big corporation, how you actually use, particularly postgraduate and research and MBAs. How do you know that they're actually working?
That's a really interesting question. Of course, the idea of understanding the impact of our research is something that we've spent a lot more time in recent years thinking about. It's an integral part of how our research is assessed, and we will, we'll, into our research projects, we will build in how we understand the mechanisms for that. I think how we do that with our students, what impact our students are having in the world once they leave us, I think is a really interesting question. And I'm not sure that we have yet moved beyond understanding what role they do, or what their return is for a ranking. So actually what difference they're making. Obviously we know our alumni and we know that they're doing great things, but I guess we're probably not yet systematically getting feedback on whether that, how we know that positive impact is taking place as we would do with our research. So I think that's a really interesting one. I think particularly because all of our learning outcomes are now around four themes. One of them is expertise, which obviously is the content, which they get taught. So that, we understand that, but we're also looking at citizenship, influence, and one of them is impact. So I think that's a really interesting question for us to reflect on and say, well, how do we not just assess their impact, that they've understood about impact at the end of their degree program, but in 5 years' time, have they, how do we know that they're having that positive impact in the world that we want them to?
And Caroline, presumably the Lloyds relationship with Birmingham isn't just to tick boxes and put your name on sponsorship, it is to bring about a change. Is that the sort of thing? What do you think about what Yvonne's just said about the way in which we monitor the impact of what goes on in business schools? Yeah,
it's very important to be monitoring that impact. And I think, with external partnerships such as this, it can be quite tricky to kind of look internally and say, okay, us having this partnership with Birmingham, what change has that led to in Lloyds? But ideas from people on how we could do that, how we could further that, very, very welcome. Maybe one example I've got that is a little bit easier for us to measure is we're rolling out sustainability training to all of our executives and actually wider populations of people across the bank this coming year. And that's been one of the things that we're very focused on in terms of looking at, well, where were people's knowledge when they started and how's it moved, and therefore, how, you know, what change has that intervention led to, and that'll be something we'll be monitoring very carefully. But knowing the impact of it, not just having a partnership to tick a box and it actually meaning something, is absolutely crucial, of course.
We're coming to the end of our time, but I've got a last question which I'd like you all to have a go at. We're all united, I'm sure, around the concept of build back better. We've all had a very difficult year, a challenging, disruptive year, and perhaps in some senses nowhere more than in universities, where it's been quite spectacular and very much in the public eye. But if we're going to build back better in business schools, what are the one or two things you'd really like to see change for the future in the way in which business schools conduct themselves? And I'm going to start with Caroline.
I think seeing this topic of responsible business really bring it into the core and the mainstream, and I think breaking down the kind of, probably, I think now out of date view that it's commercial success versus responsibility. I think there's now so much really interesting evidence that actually companies that have a really strong, responsible and sustainable business approach perform better commercially anyway. So there isn't this tension to be concerned about in a way that perhaps some students or others might feel there is still.
And they do that because they're better at risk management, which is down to your long-term thinking again. That's my idea anyway. Martin, what would you like to see change about business schools, bearing in mind you rely on one for your profession?
I do. I think, I mean, in higher education, as in many other fields, it's been a very, very difficult year for academics, for professional services staff, who've also had to make huge transitions in their working patterns, and also for our students. What it's also shown is how quickly some changes can happen when they need to. The very rapid adoption and take-up of online teaching, something people told us could never be done so quickly. You know, the fact that universities, organisations that aren't always renowned for their fleet of foot, have managed to adopt this and roll it out so quickly and so successfully in many cases, I think is a really good indication that when it needs to be done and when there's willingness to do it, we can effect change. So I think that we need to go into the recovery with that in mind, that change is possible, that we do have agency in higher education, and we need to use it as a reason not to default back to what we've done in exactly the same way previously. I think that would be lazy, and I think it would be missing a huge opportunity. Now would be a great point to do what I've mentioned a couple of times, is to take a pause and say, this has provided us with a break point. We can go back to doing what we've done traditionally and successfully in many people's views. Or we can see this as an opportunity, as a break, and say, what are we here for? What would we like to do? And how would we like to reorganise to do that as part of the recovery? And putting a sense of purpose at the heart of business schools, of higher education, with the idea of that's what we'd also like to do amongst our students. Now, go back to this idea that part of the education we're providing is helping students develop a sense of what their purpose in the world is and the type of organisations and the type of purposes that they want to be associated with as consumers, as purchasers, and as employees perhaps, or even as entrepreneurs and innovators themselves. So it all goes back to this idea of purpose, I think. And I think it's incumbent on business schools and universities to take this opportunity to put that at the heart and think about how we'll need to change to build back better.
And Yvonne, your new era resolutions.
Yeah, I think that that idea of the ability to change, I think is really critical, and I think I think for me it's not just how we're teaching, what we're teaching our students, but also how we're teaching, and how the switch to a lot of the digital online learning has taught us so much about what students need and respond well to, and how we can capture that and build on it. And I think the other thing, which is a bit kind of ironic when none of us are sort of traveling much further than our own houses, is how much closer it's brought the world into the business schools. We've been able to get access for our students to speakers who would never normally, would not necessarily visit the school, virtual placements that perhaps they just couldn't necessarily do in reality. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there to kind of bring a really global dimension to everything that we're doing, and be much more ambitious about some of those changes than we would have done before. I think, like you say, building on the confidence of what we achieved when we never thought it would be possible. I think it's now, sort of taking that step, as Martin was saying, and saying, okay, well, what could we achieve now that we know that these things are possible, and learning, I think, from the students in that, not just myself and my colleagues sitting in a meeting room and deciding that, but really, co-creating that with our students, and listening to what, what they've learned, and what they see as a better future for themselves, really.
Yes, I sum up my approach in my consultancy and writing and other work in one word, and it's the word tries. The company that tries succeeds, but tries stands for transparent, responsible, inclusive, ethical, and sustainable. Get those 5 right, and we'll all be here in 25 years' time and coming back and talking about the next generation of business schools, hopefully. But meanwhile, we're going to be having the Chartered Association of Business Schools Task Force report on business schools and the public good, issued in the spring. Wonderfully and suitably vague commitment there. But certainly I'm looking forward to that, and it's been very enjoyable working with Martin and others on that for the last couple of years. But this has been our discussion on the critical importance of education and business working in partnership. We've been talking to Yvonne Hackforth-Williams from the University of Birmingham Business School, Caroline Hill from Lloyds Bank, which sponsors the Centre for Responsible Business at Birmingham, and Martin Kitchener, Professor of Management at Cardiff University, and alongside me, the co-chair of the Chartered ABS Task Force. I'd like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank those who've been listening patiently at home. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.